welcome to our first ever all virtual nutrition hot topics. And this is our first seminar for 2021. We have a fantastic speaker today and I'm excited to get to that. But first, just a couple announcements about how the session will run today. So, and these are reiterated in the very first message in the chat box if you're not following or if you missed this. First and most important, if you have technical difficulties, Connie Shank, you can wave, Connie, show them who you are. We'll be doing our best to provide tech support. So if you have any problems during the presentation, please send a message to Connie in the chat box. Second, if you have questions for the speaker, there will be time at the end of the presentation to do some Q&A. So go ahead and post your questions in the chat box at any time and we'll cover them at the end. But be warned, our speaker, Dr. MacLean, prefers to hear the question directly from the asker. So if you post a question, if you don't mind, I'll ask you to unmute and voice your question. And last but not least, we have everyone on mute, which is typical for these meetings. Please do not unmute yourself at any time during the presentation. And now we are ready for the main event. I'm going to hand off to our very own James Hyvee to introduce today's speaker. So Dr. Hyvee, you are on.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure to introduce Bill MacLean today because I've known him for a really long time in my role with NASPGHAN, which is our National Organization of Pediatric Gastroenterology, Hepatology, and Nutrition, and his role at Ross and ultimately Abbott in terms of their long support of our fellowship programs with a fellowship retreat on an annual basis that probably is getting close to being 40 years old. But Bill is an accomplished investigator who spent part of his career in academics and then subsequently with Ross Laboratories, which became a subsidiary of Abbott. He was a graduate of Princeton as an undergraduate. His MD is from McGill. He did all of his medical training in pediatrics at Hopkins. He was then an instructor at Sam Houston when he was in the Army. That's great. So I have to get rid of that. He has been an associate professor at OSU and when he came to Ross Labs, and he was the medical director initially and then the pediatric research and development lead, and he also was a VP for medical and regulatory affairs. And as I said, we were very grateful for his support of our programs. And he's also served on a variety of advisory committees to the NIH, FDA, and WHO, has a vigorous publication record, and his presentation today should be actually quite fascinating, and he's a great speaker on the development of taste, smell, and flavor perception during early life, or how I learned to eat my spinach and love it, which I'm not sure I really ever loved eating spinach, but have at it, Bill.
Okay, thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here a year late. We actually had this set up live just about a year ago. And I remember driving back from a short vacation and getting an email, which I didn't even have to open it to know what it was going to say. But I'm glad we were able to set this up again. Okay, in any case, I got very interested in picky eating and happened to be at a meeting many years ago with a woman named Julie Manella, whose work you'll see all over this talk. And she was giving sort of the basic science and I was giving the clinical. We hadn't met before, and all of a sudden at dinner, we looked at each other and said, wait a minute, this is kind of hand in glove stuff. What you're saying makes sense to me in one way and vice versa to you. And that's kind of how I got onto this. Well, about 11 million babies are going to be born in this next hour. And the interesting thing is that regardless of where they're born, they all are going to learn to eat a whole variety of foods. They're all going to, whether they're eating Tex-Mex or fried bugs in China, you know, nothing like a little cheese sandwich here. Everybody is going to adjust to a whole wide variety of flavors, and they absolutely think their cuisine is the best. So we're going to start with what the world eats. Talk a little bit about that. We'll get into taste and smell perception, and then move from taste and smell to flavor perception. since that combines both, and spend a good deal of time on the issue of bitterness, which is one of the things that makes feeding kids so difficult. So what does the world eat? Well, biology is pretty much the same around the world. Our nutritional patterns certainly are, but how we meet those depend very much on where we live, what kind of an environment we're in, and so on and so forth. I've spent a lot of time over the years working in Peru, and Peru has three very distinctly different areas. If you're up in the Altiplano around 16,000, about 14,000 feet, this mother and her baby both are probably getting 75% of their calories from potatoes. So if you go over to the Amazon, those Peruvians have a very different diet. And then you go down to the coast, which actually is a desert. It's not in the Andes. The capital in Lima is, again, a very, very different thing. And each of those has its own Peruvian cuisine, and it's all very, very different. Well, almost all cultures over the centuries have survived on what we call the cereal legume model. Maize and beans, wheat and chickpea, that kind of thing. And if you look at the cereals, just those three cereals, maize, wheat, and rice, have 85% of the world's grain production and 40% of the calories. Now, the cereals are good sources of protein, they're good sources of essential fatty acids, but they have a problem. They're deficient in the essential amino acid lysine. If you look at legumes, which are very high in protein, also good sources of essential fatty acids, but they're deficient in the sulfur-containing amino acids, methionine and cysteine. And somehow over the eons, cultures have evolved to this cereal legume model. And if we look at it biochemically, it's what we call the complementarity of amino acids. The low lysine in cereals is offset by a very generous amount of lysine in legumes, and the reverse is true for methionine and cysteine. So this can be the basic staple in one form or another for many parts of the world. Now this chart shows you foods as the percentage of protein calories, and we as adults need somewhere in the 10% as a nice generous amount of calories as a percent of protein as a percent of calories. And you can see that even getting down into maize and now with some of the higher varieties of rice, pretty well could meet it. Excuse me, take a minute and think where breast milk would fall on this chart. 6%. Breast milk is a very low protein food, but it's got an exquisitely fine amino acid balance for a slow growing human. So these others are more than ample if they can be digested and if they have some other good proteins. Well, there are a lot of other things around the world being eaten. Grasshoppers are common in areas of Central America and Mexico. They've got about 70%, that grasshopper is about 70% protein. On the other hand, if you go to cassava here, it's about 2%. And then we have things like, what's that? It's a termite nest. So in any case, clearly biology is what's setting these things, but the flavor preferences we have all come in the context that we live in. And it's quite clear that one culture's delicacy, fried grasshoppers, perhaps termites, is another's abomination. Well, how are food preferences moved from one generation to another? First, we're going to use an overview that comes from Julie Manella and her group. And you'll see that we're going to start with the fact that there are taste and odors in amniotic fluid, which the fetus is clearly being exposed to. There are also flavors in breast milk, flavors in weaning foods, and then ultimately in the adult foods. And the thing that ties all of those together is, in fact, the adult diet. And the one exception to that is the baby who's being formula fed. So that if you look at that period when the baby through the first 4 to 6 months of age may be getting exclusive breastfeeding, that child is not getting the food flavors of the culture that it's growing into. Most food preferences are actually in place by about 3 years of age, and they seem to track for a long time, up to 15 to 20 years later. So we'll move on to taste and smell perception. And there are 5 basic tastes. 3 of them encourage us to eat food: sweet, salty, umami, which is from soy protein, and then that discourage ingestion of foods with sour flavors and bitter flavors. And we're going to spend more time on bitter, especially bitter, towards the end. There's some other areas with receptors identified for things like MCT and LCT, and clearly when you're eating lipids, the texture is a clue there. Some animals are actually able to detect starch directly before, or polysaccharides before they're digested, and we don't have that kind of a receptor. Rodents have calcium receptors. And one of the interesting things is water. You see all these advertisements for this water tastes better than that water, or that sort of thing. In fact, what we know about the taste of water is it depends very much on what's been in the mouth previously before you drink the water. So the same water source, if you've just had a sandwich of one thing, or you've decided to have a hot dog with mustard, is going to taste very different. Me, one of the really fun things is the whole issue of piquance, the hotness and heat receptors. And you think about, we always talk about babies in Latin culture, for example, or in India getting very hot foods. And it turns out there's a heat receptor, and the mouth normally doesn't feel pain from heat until it goes about 107 degrees. But capsaicin in peppers actually lowers the effective activation temperature of the mouth to about 95 degrees. So once you've got it in your mouth and it hits that receptor, you're going to have that kind of a feeling. Likewise, if in reverse, if you have the cold receptor. Well, most taste is sensed in taste buds and the rear of the tongue. We know now, we used to be taught that there were certain areas of the mouth that sense some tastes and others that didn't. We know now that virtually every taste bud, every single taste cell can taste all of these. And when we look at these various tastes, we look at salt, we look at sour, we look at sweet and umami, and these are very, very simple G protein receptors. There's one receptor for each of those. And then when you look at bitterness, we have a large family of receptors, easily 30. The number keeps growing, but probably somewhere between 35 and 40 that respond to different kinds of bitter compounds. The question, why so many? Why is it that we have developed this array of receptors and methods of taste detection for something like bitterness? Well, interestingly, we always think of our taste receptors as being in our mouth, but if you look at the fruit fly has all these small little hairs on its legs. I won't use my pointer because I'd probably advance the slide here. But those are taste receptors, and the fruit fly can sense taste and then decide if it wants to take a bite of something without ever opening its mouth, if you will. We've also thought for a long time that there are probably receptors for nutrients in the gut, and it turns out we do have sweet and bitter taste receptors in the GI tract. If you think about the blood response to sugar being run in intravenously versus sugar that's being ingested, there is a sweet receptor down there that actually then causes the release of incretins, which tends to release insulin to deal with the sugar that's coming, and it also tends to slow the gastric emptying somewhat. So it's a means of dealing with that. We have bitter receptors in our lungs, which is very interesting because these bitter receptors seem to react to, for example, if you aspirate and you get acid going into the lung, it causes the smooth muscle to dilate rather than to constrict. So it seems like a helpful mechanism to have. Smell is far more complicated than taste. This is, these two are Richard Axtell and his student Linda Buck. They first found the genes that encode for G protein coupled receptors, 1,000 of them, to about 2004, when they got the Nobel Prize. We said it was about 10,000. We now know that it's probably somewhere in the millions or trillions of distinct odor qualities that that our brain can sense. There are about 400 nuclei up top there that from the brain, the smell goes directly into the brain. It's sensed first in the nose, but then it's processed in the brain to sort through exactly what the sense is. Now, a lot of our receptors are turned off. Dogs have about 50 times as many olfactory receptors. And of course, we see them in the airports doing detection. There are also studies I'm sure you're aware of for the use of dogs in looking for people who have cancer. Very good, apparently, seems to be good for melanoma. And they're also looking at it for the COVID virus, detecting that kind of thing. Well, clearly humans and dogs have a little different take on things. So, you know, nice to meet you. I've smelled so much about you. And as we know, if you've ever taken a walk with a dog in the woods, that's pretty accurate. Excuse me. The key things, two key things which are at the bottom of this slide are that odors, not odors, are a key component of flavor perception. They're half of flavor perception. And the other is that like taste, it's mostly a learned process. Odors are also very powerful in terms of causing emotions. And you think about when you, you know, think about going home for a holiday, and you can think about the odors in the kitchen when you were a kid and your mom was baking things or making things. This was an experiment that shows what they call the power of transference of odors. And in this particular study, they took roughly 55-year-olds and they confronted them with a maze that was impossible to do. And they did this first part of the study in a room that had what was called pleasant odor, as in northern rainforest. It sounds like something that you would find in a can in a powder room, I guess, but apparently it seemed pleasant enough. And this mask was built so that if you started in the center, there was no way you could possibly find your way out. So all of these kids were frustrated when they were trying to do this. They gave them a break, you know, got a book, read, do something, just kind of calm down. And then they went back into 3 different rooms. One had that same northern rainforest, another a different scent, and one had no scent whatsoever. And they were all asked to do a timed worksheet. They had a sheet that had about 50 different pictures of puppies, and a few of the puppies were missing tails, and they had to circle the number of puppies that didn't have a tail. Well, the ones who were in the room with the same odor scored significantly lower than the other 2 groups, a different odor or no odor. And this is an example of transference. And it turns out that this transference works in terms of lodging memories, so that if you ask people our age, what brings back things about their early childhood, it's often the smells of foods and other things. So the importance here is that flavor is taste and smell. And I think we've all had that probably in high school biology, where you put on a bandana and somebody gave you either an apple or an onion to eat. And if your nose is blocked off, you can eat the onion and you really can't quite tell what it is. Memories are very lifelong and obvious. I mean, the odors, and obviously odors are a big part of the feeding environment, both where the food's being prepared and the ambient environment in general. Excuse me. Well, from there, let's move on from flavors to foods. And we're going to go back to that same paradigm and look at when children begin to be able to sense different flavors and smells. If you ask a mother who's going into labor to either chew some garlic, small amount of garlic, or take something with a niece, and then you go and when the baby's a couple days of age, you hold various scents in front of the baby's nose. Babies whose mothers got garlic will pick that scent out and react to it, whereas they won't generally to much else. Same with the niece. So it's clear that infants who are swallowing amniotic fluid throughout pregnancy are being exposed to a variety of odors. At the time the baby's born, most babies can pretty well taste everything except for salt. And salt taste develops at about 4 months of age. And then our desire for salty foods kind of goes up early into about our teen years, and then it tends to settle back down for most of us, other than me, when you get to be in your late teen years. Flavors in breast milk, again, very potent in terms of getting children learning about different flavors. And I'll show you, I think, was a very informative study. Pregnant women were randomized to either carrot juice or water. And then they were randomized to 2 groups. One was going to drink 4 days a week during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy and then go to water after the baby was born. And the next one was going to do the reverse, water and then carrot juice. So you had 2 groups here, what we call the carrot water group or the water carrot group. And then there was a water control group. And they went back and when they followed the babies, and when the babies were getting close to 4 to 5 months of age, getting ready to introduce solid foods, and they had spontaneously introduced, the parents had introduced them to cereal. Before they had any other foods, they mixed carrot juice into the cereal on one day, one feeding, and they looked to see how much cereal the baby would eat. And here you see the women who had, the babies who had mothers who did carrot juice during pregnancy, but not postpartum, the ones who had water and then carrot juice and the water. And it's clear that the exposure during utero, being for the baby during the 3rd trimester pregnancy, had a potent effect on the willingness to eat carrots. Now, carrots are one of the bitter foods, and we're going to go the rest of the time and focus mostly on the issue of bitterness and delve into what's been called the omnivore's dilemma and neophobia. And you'll see why those studies of carrot juice and like those like them turn out to be so important. Well, in 1931, Dr. Arthur Fox had a laboratory accident. He was making up some phenylthiocarbamide. And I'm going to read you a couple of sentences. I'm sure which journal articles today read the way they did back then. But here's what he said at one of his presentations. He said, "Some time ago, the author had occasion to prepare a quantity of phenylthiocarbamide. And while placing it in a bottle, the dust flew around in the air. Another occupant of the laboratory, Dr. C.R. Noller, complained of the bitter taste of the dust, but the author, who was much closer, observed no taste and so stated. He even tasted some of the crystals and assured Dr. Noller they were tasteless. But Dr. Noller was equally certain that it was the dust he tasted, so he tried some of the crystals and found them extremely bitter. With those two diverse observations as a starting point, they then went on and did a whole series of studies, first in humans, those of different ethnic backgrounds, ultimately in chimpanzees, and they described the fact that there were certain groups of humans who are what is known as taste blind. They have an inability or a very decreased ability to detect bitter taste. And likewise, there are those who are super tasters. I was talking to Dr. Balistreri about a year and a half ago when I was in Cincinnati, and if I recall correctly, he's a super taster. And when he was first married, I think I'm not telling any secrets, his wife had baked a pie, which he found rather bitter, and was smart enough not to say anything. And apparently everyone else thought it was just fine. So these are real life things, if you will. Well, what is the role of bitterness? A lot of plants are bitter. This is the castor plant, which is a large, tall growing plant, and from which castor beans come, and from which ricin, which is extremely toxic, comes. And there are lots of plants, many plants that are bitter. And the rejection of bitter tasting foods by animals tends to protect animals who aren't familiar with a food from eating a food that is not going to be particularly good for them. Now, likewise, you can understand the plants are happy because it keeps them from being eaten. So it's a survival mechanism for both of them in different ways. Now, some of you may recognize this gentleman. This gentleman is Michael Pollan. And Michael Pollan wrote a book in the mid 2000s, published a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma. And in it, he basically asked the question, what should we have for dinner? And he looked at 4 different meals and traced where the meals came from and how they were produced, and really got into some of the ethical and cultural issues about food production and how we choose to eat. But it turns out that the Omnivore's Dilemma was first used by Dr. Paul Rosen, 1976. Dr. Rosen is still at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was then. He's about 83 or 84. And he published a paper called The Selection of Foods by Rats, Humans, and Other Animals. And he said, how do omnivores avoid dangerous, poisonous foods? That's what he wanted to know. And if you think about it, there are some animals who handle this because they're all monivores. The giant panda just eats eucalyptus leaves to excess. Down in the lower right-hand corner, you see an egg-eating snake in Africa that literally climbs trees and robs eggs from people. There are other animals like the monarch butterfly, and these tend to eat milkweed of only certain varieties. But human and other mammals have a whole variety of foods that they are exposed to, and how do they decide what's safe to eat and what's not safe to eat? But one of the mechanisms that all animals have is something that's called neophobia, which is the rejections of foods that are novel or unknown. So there's a great reluctance of young children, as other animals, to take in foods that they're not familiar with. This is not the rejection of foods after they've had a taste or two. It's just simply the initial rejection. And if you look at that graph, you will see that this goes up in early childhood, peaks probably somewhere in the more 3 to 4 years of age, and then goes back down as we get older. Well, most mammals learn what's an acceptable taste from the milk that they're consuming from their mother. And if you look at this cow is grazing on grasses and perhaps eating those shrubs, and is passing those flavors on as acceptable, the seal of approval, so to speak, from the mother to her calf. And if the calf goes and eats something that is not tasting like that, it's going to tend to reject it. There's a group of hunter-gatherers who live in the Kalahari Desert. These mothers are incredible in that they nurse their babies about 100 times a day, and they carry them 24 hours a day. If they're not carrying them, the baby is sleeping on their stomach. So they are exposed to the foods of the mother, but it's only when they first get up, when they become ambulatory, that they're being exposed to other things. And by that time, they're pretty well imprinted with flavor patterns that they know are acceptable. Well, what are the typical foods that we feed babies at the beginning? You look at that list, which is pretty standard, we'd all agree that those are pretty much sweet. And if you look at ones on the right, these are the bitter foods, peas, spinach, carrots, and squash, and they're the ones that cause a problem. So the question that people have asked, and Dr. Manella and her group are in the forefront of this, as no surprise, are there sensitive periods for the development of bitter taste perception? And is there a way that we could alter the acceptance of these by children? I'm going to show you two studies here that they have done that I think they shed some light on this. All of you who have dealt with kids who have needed hydrolysate formulas or other special diets know that the earlier they are introduced, generally the better they are tolerated. Excuse me, if you have a child with an inborn error of metabolism who has to go on an amino acid based diet and you're starting it from birth, for them, that's just normal. But if you have a child who develops a GI problem and maybe 7 or 8 months of age, would do well to go on an extensively hydrolyzed product. That's another issue entirely. So what this group did was to randomize children at 6 months of age, either to a protein hydrolysate formula or to a cow milk formula. And they followed them up to 7.5 months of age. And what I've done in this graph is just show you the two extremes, because what they did is they tested them monthly. And there were some kids who they tested in terms of introduction in the cow milk group at, say, 1.5 months or 3.5 months or 5.5 months. But what I'm going to show you was the final study where they brought the kids in and they gave each child a bottle of protein hydrolysate formula. So up top here, you see the child who's been getting protein hydrolysate for 7.5 months, basically since birth. And that baby just takes the bottle and reaches forward and is happy as a clam. The little child on the left thinks that he or she is about to get cow milk formula, but very quickly is disabused of that fact and absolutely will not take it. And I think we've all seen or heard about this kind of problem with kids who were trying to get on these specialized diets. Well, there's one other study that I think informs this, and that is the fact that not all hydrolysates taste the same. And so because you start on one hydrolysate may be a reason to keep on that hydrolysate. And what they did in this study was take 3 groups of kids, not randomized at all. Some were on cow milk, some were on Alimentum, and some were on Nutramigen. And after they'd been on that for a number of weeks, they went back and they tested them. So what they did here in the first set of bars, you see all the babies who'd been on either Alimentum or Nutramigen. All the babies who'd been on cow milk were given Alimentum and then another time Nutramigen. And you can see that basically they don't like it. They're not going to eat it. If you take the group that's been on Alimentum and you give them an Alimentum feeding, you have very good intake. But if you give them a Nutramigen feeding, even though they're used to one hydrolysate, they don't necessarily like the other hydrolysate. And likewise, the reverse. If they've been on Nutramigen and they get Nutramigen, they take it well. And one should not make any comparisons between these two bars because these were different groups of children, different ages. It's just the way it worked out. It's not meant to say that children who've been on Nutramigen are going to take Alimentum better than children on Alimentum will eventually take Nutramigen. But I think it's a very interesting thought. And for those of you who take care of kids, keep that in mind if it comes to a point where you may need to change something. Well, I think what we can say is both the timing and duration of exposure to bitter flavored things affects their acceptance. And I asked the question here, are there things we could be doing to children, not just who need those kinds of diets, but to better condition them for the bitter vegetables that they're inevitably going to get and need to learn to eat, starting in the at least after 4 to 6 months of exclusive milk or breastfeeding. So Summarizing, infants are exposed to flavors in utero. They develop their sense of taste and smell beginning at that point. Most of their food preferences are going to be learned by 2 to 3 years of age. And so you have to be careful about how you introduce things. Smell is far more complex than taste, and it's a major part of flavor. It also, these odors preferences are primarily learned, and they have a much bigger impact on emotions than just taste alone, if you will. Breastfed babies accept a broader range of foods, but not if the mothers haven't been eating them when they're nursing. So we don't have data to say that making the diet more liberal with regard to bitter things in the last trimester will have a carryover effect. My guess would be, based on the study I showed you, that would be a good strategy. But it certainly means that mothers who are nursing have a role to play by having a varied diet. Bitterness of vegetables makes their acceptance very problematical, and there appears to be a sensitive period. Thank you very much. I wish you luck. Those of you who have been through this with young kids know what it's all about, and the rest of you have a lot to look forward to.